Shogun is an incredibly brutal but enthralling body of work. Having stumbled upon the series through sheer luck with random discussions through friends, I was curious and pleasantly surprised to see what is effectively the Japanese equivalent of Game of Thrones, and possibly even better. For those who have yet to discover it, the series follows the journey of an Englishman as he sails towards Japan in an effort to establish a new trade route between his two countries, in a period where only the Spanish and Portuguese know of such paths. The year is 1600 and the religious wars between the Protestant English against the Roman Catholics has been raging on, which has made the journey to Japan even more hostile and risky given the influence of Christianity in the region and the hatred between both parties. Essentially, imagine trying to make friends with a random stranger who's best friends with your worst enemy, and then add to that they can actually speak the language of the stranger's tongue. But that's actually one half of the story, because riddled throughout this is a story for the fight for supreme power, as within Japan itself lies a political battle between five lords who formed a council after the death of their previous leader, but who now seek to gain the ultimate title of Shogun, the supreme military chief commander. And I gotta tell you, it is fucking fantastic. From the opening episode, we're introduced to this world of what you think will initially be a pirate's tale, marooned upon a creaky, old, dying ship with barely a few crew members left to steer it to salvation. It felt like a much grittier version of Pirates of the Caribbean, because some of the cinematography and lighting was just breathtakingly dark and moody. I also loved the hair and makeup, especially on our Englishman John Blackthorne, who legitimately looked like he was going to die, and I could barely tell how the actor looked like underneath all of that makeup. He also has one of the deepest and most badass sounding voices that I've heard from a character.
That would be a coward's way out.
But then all this mood changes dramatically as the crew finally reaches the shores of Japan and are met by a native village with an army of soldiers that are less than exactly hospitable towards them. It's nothing horrendously brutal yet, because, well, the curiosity of who these foreign invaders still leads them to being at least somewhat neutral to find out more. But that doesn't stop them from straight away treating them as barbarians. And it's this dynamic between the two parties that immediately puts such an interesting conflict of trying to figure out how does one who has no clue of the language settle in and accustom themselves in a world where they are not the powerful conqueror and where they are at the mercy of the people who look at them with disgust. It's also almost the direct opposite to seeing what occurred in history, where Englishmen who would have visited and conquered so many other lands as they expanded their own reach of the English Empire. But this is where things take a turn for the worse, as one of the English sailors is sentenced to death, and I won't spoil exactly how they are killed, but man oh man, it is easily one of the most horrifying ways I've seen put onto screen. It was at that moment that the shock factor went up a notch, and after seeing heads roll off and seppukus being enacted, this to me signaled that the show was unfazed by going to the extreme, and that it was the start of something bold and like anything that's come before. Again, the TV show Game of Thrones does come to mind, but unlike that series, one of the biggest differences apart from the language barrier is the themes around honor and duty. To me, Game of Thrones is more about the heritage and the honor that comes from being part of a certain family, while also being about the search for gaining more power. But in Shogun, it's really about the honor of allegiances, the honor of your country, and ultimately the honor of one's own character. Shogun is all about how someone conducts themselves in matters both privately and publicly, and it's kind of amazing to see how much to an extreme a culture cultivates this type of attitude within their own population. Almost everyone that you'll see in the show treats their actions, thoughts, and words as an incredibly sacred thing, not even with how they are with others, but especially with how they are when they are alone. Because if they do anything that veers them off a certain path, or that would make them feel dishonorable, they will not even hesitate to commit the highest of consequences and end their entire bloodline forever. It is legitimately that extreme, but it also completely makes sense, because that is the world that they have known, and the ideal of chasing for true honor is by definition an honorable pursuit. It also reminds me of this quote from the legendary samurai Ishida Mitsunari, who said, "Honor may not win power, but it wins respect, and respect earns power." That's why it's so interesting to see people who take being honorable to such a high standard, particularly when in so many times the honorable action spells death for themselves, but also when you can see in moments where they often contemplate turning towards an action that they deep down know is against their own code. For those moments where you can see they begin to even question why they even have such traditional practices in the first place, when doing so can put into risk the very nature of their nation's future. You can see people wondering why they act like they do when it might not be the best for everyone, despite what happens to them. And having someone from an entirely different culture question their own practices also adds to this internal conflict. Altogether, this show is about the pressure from both within and outside of your own domain, and I simply love watching it all unfold. Compared to the look of other shows like Netflix's live-action rendition of Avatar, and even the upcoming Star Wars The Acolyte, the production quality feels so much higher from both the cinematic visual standpoint and in the writing. This is a show that has one of the greatest Japanese actors, Hiroyuki Sanada, on board as a producer, who I feel has a genuine commitment in ensuring the integrity and authenticity of the work, and to make sure that it lives up to James Clavell's great novel, which is ultimately why I have such high praise for it now, as so far as I can tell, it clearly shows. And given we're halfway through the season, I sincerely hope it continues down that track in the same vein.
Maybe you'll live long enough to find out what it is.